Well, I think I do see a lot of teams that deliver with no idea if there's an impact or not. And I think what happens like in the circle is that it just goes on and on like that. You deliver, you deliver, you deliver, and there's not a good measurement of, okay, what happens after you deliver instead of just checking the box of like, okay, my roadmap is on track.
Welcome back to Excuse My SaaS, the podcast powered by ProdCamp, your revenue-centric user feedback platform. I'm Matej, your host, and I'm thrilled to welcome Alexandra Lung to the show today. Alexandra is this kind of product leader who's seen it all, scaling Aircall to unicorn status, navigating complex M&As at Signature Hit, and transforming product teams into true growth engines. Alexandra doesn't just build features. She builds products that deliver measurable business impact. So together today, we're diving into one hell of a question. Why do so many product teams fail to drive business results, even when they are shipping tons of features at speed? And what can we do to fix it? So why is this topic so important? Well, since the 2020 Product Intelligence Report from Amplitude and Surveycate, we know 70% of software product features go underutilized. That means for every million your product team spend, only 300K of that work actually impacts your product adoption, revenue, and growth. So that's not just a problem. It's a crisis that's crippling every SaaS profitability. With us, Alexandra will share her nonsense approach to killing bad ideas, aligning roadmaps with outcomes, and bridging the gap between product and business teams. So if you're ready to ground your product in impact, make sure your teams are delivering features that drive growth and adoption, then this episode is for you. Hey, Alexandra, welcome to the show. Did I miss anything?
Hello, Matej. Thank you for having me. No, that was great.
Cool. Awesome. Ready to get started?
Yes, let's go.
Okay, let's start with the burning question. Why? Why do product teams love shipping features even when they know it's not what drives growth? Is it laziness, habits, or something else entirely?
Why they're doing it, it's that most of the time, this is what they're asked to do, right? To ship that feature and really focus on those outcomes, really the next features. And it also gives a false sense of advancing, right? Like we're advancing, we're productive, we ship new things. But I think the overarching problem here is really the lack of strategy and measurement. It's like really thinking of how will you know that you're moving the needle? And I think this is something that we see in a lot of companies. Like most of the times when I joined as CPO, these topics like the strategy, the data, the OKRs, and the impact were always in the top priorities.
Okay, but don't you think most product teams already think they have a real strategy? I mean, what's the biggest lie product teams tell themselves about delivering business impact?
The biggest lie is that we cannot really measure the impact, right? It's like you're continuously delivering. Maybe you've delivered, 10 features in the last quarter. How can we know exactly which of these features actually had an impact or not? And also, it's not just us, right? There's also marketing, there's also sales team, there's also branding, there's also support. So that there are so many other things that it's actually, I think this is one of the things that product teams say to themselves, like, I cannot really measure that impact. And it's false, actually, in most times.
Yeah, okay. That's a nice one. And we'll get back to that in a sec. Now, if a product roadmap or backlog, for what matter, is filled with features, is it a sign that the team is lost? What does that say about the leadership and maybe the vision?
Filled with features. I think I've seen both. I've both seen roadmaps that's super full and I saw no roadmap at all. And I think in both cases, it's really, for me, about the lack of strategy and lack of what do you want to impact? What are those most important problems or opportunities that you need to tackle in order to get to your strategy and your vision? How do you measure where you are today and how do you measure where you want to be tomorrow once you've launched all this?
Yeah, okay. So just before you were saying teams think they can't measure their impact. And when we were preparing this interview, we discussed outcome-based roadmap as a way to change that, right? But I know you do a lot of them, but if they are so effective, why aren't they default in SaaS? What's stopping teams from making the shift?
That's a great question. I think it's like a lot of these methodologies that are quite effective that I like. Look, I've been doing that for 10 years now or more. And with these methodologies, I can still see companies that came to me to help them do it. And I think it's also like, especially when it comes to outcome-based roadmaps, it's not such an easy mindset to put in practice. I would say, like, even I can see it even when I give the workshops and I train teams on this. It has multiple steps, and it's always like you need to really know how to go about it. For example, you start with the problem, which is already like sometimes we jump to the solutions, right? So how do you start with the problem? And then I really challenge, there's a specific way in challenging what the problem is. Like a lot of times we just settle for a problem that is quite generic. Like, I don't know, if I talk about SaaS, and then, for example, a lot of times the outcome, like how am I solving this problem for the user, is like, oh, it's more effective. Like you could almost say more effective for everything.
Yeah.
Then, like, how do you measure it, and then how do you understand where the real outcome for the clients is? So it's really about asking the right questions and getting to the bottom of the problem and the nuances of the problem that you want that's really meaningful to solve. And once you've done it, then really try to define what's the outcome for the clients, but for the user, but also what's the business impact that comes with it, and really mix both of them together, the user and the business impact.
Okay. Now we were talking about the fact 70% of the SaaS products are kind of underutilized. So maybe two questions. Do you believe that? Is it true from your experience? And maybe if you had to delete half the features in a product to refocus impact, how would you decide which one stays?
If the features are underutilized, I think a lot of the times, yes. But I think it's also what I've seen in a lot of companies. It's a lack of clarity over that. A lot of companies don't really know, maybe apart from that key core value module or feature, they don't really know which features are used or not. So I think my first answer when I heard this question was like data. I mean, I first need to know, right? I need to know who uses, what they use. And once I need to understand the why behind it. Yeah, I mean, I did both build products and also launch a lot of products. I always think in terms of, as I was saying before, well, first starting with the strategy and then a mix of business impact and user impact. You need to be tackling the most painful and important problems for your users, but in the same time, when you solve those, you need to bring to your business extra value as well. So those are really the most meaningful, I would say, features or opportunities that I usually aim for. It seems easy like this, but then when you get into the details of what's really the business impact, like how tricky the problem is for the users, and so that's where it gets a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I'm sure it depends a lot of the complexity of the problem you're trying to solve and the complexity of the solution you're trying to deliver for this specific problem. Love it. Let's talk about something a bit unpopular for a moment: failure. What's a roadmap decision maybe you regret, and where was it rooted?
One of the decisions that I think it was quite a failure at the time was like, back in the days, I was first PM for a SaaS startup, and basically the roadmap was defined by external stakeholders. So basically one day, CEO and sales team, they came and they were like, we need to launch publicly this new version of our product, and we have this public launch with the media, with everyone in 2 months, so you need to have A, B, C, D and so on for this public launch. So basically the roadmap was defined without really asking to the team. Well, the features were already there. So if I come back to, well, real problem, real impact, real data, it was just like, it's on the list, it needs to be done. But it's also like, we're not asking the teams how much they can do, because I think it's also like, okay, impact, but impact needs to be linked to timing as well. So basically what happened is that we worked a lot in order to deliver, and everyone was getting really tired in the team. And when we got quite close to that date of the event, I think it was like 1 or 2 weeks before, we said, okay, we cannot have everything done. It's obvious now. And then basically we faked some of the features just to a demo. And the day after this public event, half of the team went on vacation. A lot of people were really tired. Some people even left after that. It was also a lack of, I think, mix of also lack of sense and impact in itself, but also of just like running after something that was defined with an unreasonable deadline and just scope. So I think this shows both, and of course, as everyone was like this afterwards, I think for 1 month or 2 months, we didn't deliver much afterwards. So in the end, it was quite a slowdown for the product itself and for the people in the team. So I think one of my biggest learnings that I think, I know it's tricky because we're always asked for dates. And in this case, it seemed like it was such a, like a fixed date you cannot move. It's to always like try to negotiate and show more like what could have more impact. Maybe sometimes, as we were talking about numbers of features before, like maybe you don't need a list of 10, maybe you need a list of 2, really, really.
Right.
They're really trying to be in that conversation about the strategy and about what we prioritize and then deliver on it.
That's really interesting. I guess that's classic, actually. I mean, navigating power lines and decision making is probably one of the most underrated but valuable skills for any leader and for CPOs as well. I want to switch topic a bit and talk about testing and validation. I'm following your content on LinkedIn for some time now, and you're not really looking at this like everyone else. So I believe you said quite often that not all ID deserve a prototype. I would like to understand, what do you mean by this, and maybe what's the quickest way you would recommend to kill bad ideas before they waste resources and spot the ones worth exploring?
Exactly. It's funny because I think it's been years I've been advocating for testing and not just developing, but it is true. I think we shouldn't be testing everything. Usually the way I go about it is that you need to think in terms of hypotheses. Basically, if I solve problem A by doing B, then the impact is X. So at the beginning, what you do is that like we have a list of hypotheses that are of course linked to both to your strategy, but also to bigger or smaller problems. So I will usually, of course, if I need to test, I will test the biggest ones. And usually the solution that is linked to these problems is more or less risky. Like the way I define risky usually is how likely is this to kill your business? If you implement this and you have it wrong, how likely is it to kill or negatively impact your business? So I will always test just the high risk hypothesis or the high risk either on the problem or on the solution. Because in the end, if we go back to the basics, like here, what we want to do is to minimize the risk, right? So all your hypotheses, like you state your hypothesis clearly and you're like, okay, which one is riskiest? That's the one I want to test. Like, I don't know, like let's say once we have like tons of different ideas of solutions, like one was let's change a wording on something. Well, in B2C, it can be very, very impactful, but in our context of our product, like between changing the wording on something and creating a completely customizable homepage of the app, you can definitely see which one is the riskiest and where you want to put your time and money in. Because in the end, basically you're testing because you do not want to spend time or money developing something that will not work in the end, right? But even for testing, you need to be lean as well, because you cannot chase all the different ideas that you have. Because even though you try to test with the least amount of effort and time, it still takes some time, right? So you need to pick your battles. And I usually do it thinking in terms of risk.
Right. And we need to understand that we're still making bets, even if they are kind of evidence guided. They're still not certain. Now, coming back to navigating power lines, how do you test product ideas when stakeholders are pushing for immediate action? So can you sell passions to a board or a CEO?
It depends, I guess, on the CEO, on the board. A lot of times it's very tricky. And what I usually do is that I pick my battle. Like I will try to, as soon as I join or as soon as I have a new team that needs to get onboarded on this lean management thinking, what I do is that I kind of pick my timing and my my topic. For example, when I was at Aircall, like we had like 15 projects in parallel or more, and we were basically working on voice. It was like a cloud telephony system, and we were launching an SMS part. And like when I joined, I was like, okay, we need to do some research on this. Like we need to better understand the problems. We need to test some ideas of solutions. And actually, this was true for multiple of the projects I had in parallel. But for this one, the development team was working on some basics, like the basic architecture of what we needed to put in place for the SMS part, so for the non-voice product. So I knew I will have at least 3 weeks where they need to work on that. And if I move really fast with my team, that gives us some time without blocking any of the progress in order to start proving that we can learn and test things beforehand. And once you do it, and you saw like in this case, like I didn't have to say, wait for a few weeks for all my projects and I will show you the impact. I just picked the one where I knew there's going to be no friction because the teams were already busy. And once we learned things, we were very vocal about it. Like, you need to communicate, like, look what we learned. And well, we were thinking about making this decision, but after learning this with users and testing, we realized that why. So you also show how this kind of helps you in making better decisions. And then little by little, the conversation gets easier for that other project. Actually, I will take a couple of weeks to start continuous discovery and to start running some experiments. So I think this is one of the ways that I was able to, when I had not need to negotiate that much, because I can kind of find the right moment and the right topic, that this whole evangelizing what you learned afterwards is also very important to starting showing the value of it. And it's funny because in a lot of companies, it kind of becomes almost like after a few of these, they're like, did you talk to users? There's this one.
So you educate them meanwhile as well.
Yeah, it kind of becomes something that comes way more natural. But then sometimes you get into what we were talking earlier, like, did you test this one? And I'm like, oh no, I'm not testing everything.
Right.
Kind of finding the balance.
So continuing on experimentation, what's one experiment you run that completely changed how you approach a product strategy?
And there was a really nice experiment we ran. It's more on product itself, I would say, than product strategy, but it shows really nicely like how you can test without that much effort. So basically, we were rebuilding the homepage of app, and we had a lot of questions like, what are the main problems? We had a lot of hypotheses, and the hypotheses were both on the main needs and struggles. They were on information architecture also. It's like, what do they need to see? What do they need to see faster? In which way are they? So we had a lot of hypotheses. So like usually what you would do in B2B is to create a prototype, like more or less low fidelity. You show it to users, then they give you insights, then you iterate, and then you show it again, and so on and so forth. But actually, instead of that, like what we did is like I sometimes run workshops around lean experiments. And so we all have the hypotheses, and then everyone comes up with different ways of testing. Right. And then we have the measurement, like I will know it's true if A or B happens. So basically what we did here, instead of like 4 or 5 rounds of like prototyping one after the other, what we did is that we actually went there with a blank page and with little papers that were printed, which were parts of the homepage that we imagined. And we told our users, create your ideal homepage. So basically, they took our little papers, which were like the main bits of information that we wanted.
Some blocks, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They took the different blocks. They created their ideal page. They were able to also kick out things from our blocks. So their blocks were out, and they were also able to add new blocks if they wanted, if we really missed something. And it was super interesting because in the end, we learned in only a few interviews and one session what were the most important things for them? What were the things that we would have just been a waste to put there because they didn't really want to see on the homepage? And we also understood even like the design of the page, the information architecture. Like, I want to see this up of the score. I want to see this down. This is something I need to see. This is something I don't need to see. So it was, I think it was so much learning with very little effort in the end.
Love it. I'm sure that will be interesting for many people who will listen to this.
Yeah, it's funny when I showed this to one of my teams in the past, they were like, "Oh, we have this idea for next week. We want to use this."
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to implement it. It's easy to do it, and from what you shared now, the amount of insight looks really invaluable. So that's,
but I think what's really important in these things is to really always be like, what do I want to learn, and what's the best way of learning it? Even if this experiment was really a great one in terms of learning and time spent, you need to think for each of your situations basically what's best. And I think
there's no blueprints.
Yeah, I think it's also the case. A lot of times teams just run A/B tests all the time, or they run prototype tests all the time, and they don't really stop Like, is this risky enough, or is there maybe a better other way that I could test it?
Yeah, I agree. I also seen that more often than not, it's hard to understand whether the bet is risky enough to want to make the testing and validation, no matter it could be zero. If, it's easily revertible, it doesn't change much, why would you even spend a minimal amount of time to test and validate that? So that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And sometimes you can even maybe just coding could be faster in some cases. And sometimes you might
Right.
also need a scale validation, because it's true that I could, A/B testing that give you a bit more scale, but depending on type of tests,
Right.
you always need to kind of choose what's the best way of doing it.
Great. Now, moving on to bridging product and business. I think you've seen that as well. Many people are talking about it. Why do marketing, sales, and product teams seems to be at war in so many SaaS companies? What's your take on that? Is it ego, structure, something deeper?
Yeah. I think for sure we see it in so many places. I think for me, most of the times, like the fundamental problem is the lack of a common objective. A lot of times teams are just incentivized so differently, and they each kind of just try to be like, well, I want to do this. Are you helping me or not? And I think it's that. And also sometimes maybe even a lack of understanding or interest in understanding, like, what are the stakes of the other?
Yeah.
Usually, I think when we, like in exec teams, this is what we're really trying to aim for, like a North Star metric, or aiming for, just a common objective that everyone can kind of build towards. But then I think it's also a matter of like from the management to the teams, like really collaborating together. And if you have a common objective, it's easier. But also if you don't have, like, kind of trying to understand, it's like, what are your clients asking? How long is it for you to sell? When do you need this information in order to really create a good communication for my launch? Why does it take so long? Really trying to also understanding each other's stakes. And I think also collaborating more. There's a lot of ways of involving sales beforehand in prioritization. And once they see that it's not an infinite number of things that we can get out in a week or a quarter, and if they're part of it, they will also have more skin in the game. And like, once me or people from my product or design team go meet clients, and you see like how negotiations happen, you see what are the needs of the clients, you are also way more aligned with the reality of the business, and you're also able to create better collaboration, but also better products in the end.
Right. I'm convinced that if teammates would just walk in each other's shoes for maybe a week, and have the feel of what it means having their goal, just that would mean probably would have less engineering team emoji celebrate the speed of delivery, but everyone else missing targets, like, marketing emoji celebrate MQLs and everyone else missing target or whatnot. So.
And it's interesting because there are companies where, like, even in the onboarding, like for example at Aircall, in the onboarding, my teams would all go through like a few hours with support, like hearing how support goals happen, a few hours with the CSM teams, a few hours with sales teams. Like, you would really see the reality of how it happens instead of just like a 20 minutes chat on like, oh, hi.
Right. Yeah, and it's underrated. This is really underrated to have this, but it should essential and should be a part of every onboarding in B2B SaaS, at least. Okay, no name here. I don't want you to get in trouble with this one, but when was the last time you saw a product team deliver a feature that made no business sense at all, and what happened next?
Well, I think I do see a lot of teams that deliver with no idea if there's an impact or not. And I think what happens, like in the circle, is that it just goes on and on like that. You deliver. And there's, as a lot of times, they're not a good measurement of, what happens after you deliver, instead of just checking the box of like, okay, my roadmap is on track. So I think it's really, for me, that's what I see a lot. And it goes back to what I was saying before on your roadmap that starts with the problems and then the solutions and then the tests. And what's interesting is that I've also seen the opposite. I worked with a team that had a really big impact. In 1 year, they smashed it. Their results were amazing. And they got to a point where they needed to keep driving growth. And they had no idea why, because they had knew what was the big reason that they succeeded that year. But as they didn't test more granular things, they didn't know which of the features of the changes actually had most potential and which of those features had most potential for growth going forward. So it's interesting because for them, it went really well for a while. And then they got stuck on what's next now? Because I'm not sure which button to push because I measure my impact globally. But I didn't measure the impact of the bits and pieces of the puzzle that I put in for the whole last year.
That's really interesting. It's kind of funny sometimes to see that despite months spent on strategy that make us believe we are in control, we actually often lack understanding of the capacities that helped us actually capture and deliver value per se. So it's a really interesting example here.
Yeah, and I think it goes also back to being incremental, really
right. Slicing the elephant.
Exactly. And seeing the impact and you're like, okay, here I had a lot of impact. Should I push forward or this is good? Let's go to the other one. But you still keep in mind of keeping track on that and then going back on it afterwards. And it's really following up on the impact in this granular way and not just okay, this is growing. This metric is growing.
Great. Let's celebrate.
Great. Up to the point where it won't be. And you're like, okay, now what?
Great. Now, this one might be a bit controversial, but if a product leader can't show the business impact of their roadmap, do they really deserve a seat at the executive table?
Wow, tough question. I think definitely as product leaders, we need to show the business impact of what we're doing. And I think especially in the last years as well, the tech scene changed also quite a lot. There was always a need for this. And I think this was always also, it was a big part of the role. But I think in the last years, it's just becoming clearer and clearer that we're not just okay, let's have more revenue and just more features and then we'll see. It's really about understanding what's behind, understanding financials, understanding what's behind those financials, understanding how to push that forward. But I also think it's sometimes it's not very easy. As I was saying, sometimes you take CPO job and then there's no data, there's no good methods. Maybe sales cycles are quite long. So sometimes it's not super direct. It's okay, you start and then a week later you can already show impact. There's some groundwork to be done in order to properly be able to move the needle, but also to show that impact. And I think that's also a very tricky part of the role. It's how do you show progress and link to business while you're also setting up a lot of things to get
foundation.
Exactly. How do you build the foundations, but already start having business impact that you can measure? I think it's all about really having a clear view on the steps and always linking to business from the beginning, even though you don't have a perfect foundation, but still build those foundations, because if not, you're going to be at fault sooner or later. You're going to be in the big bubble of is it growing or not, but I'm not sure why and I don't know where to put my finger on.
Yeah, and maybe just mix it with a couple of quick wins from the start so you can get this impact you were talking about. Okay, let's move on a bit. I know it's a question you might hear a lot, but I wanted to ask it again. What's the one metric you think every product team should be obsessed over, and maybe why it isn't NPS?
Yes. Yeah, I think NPS, it's too wide. As it's influenced by so many criteria, it's quite hard to really understand how much product has an impact on it. I've been in some companies where we were splitting the NPS feedbacks by buckets. You could see what's linked to product, what's linked to tech, what's linked to sales, what's linked to pricing or to support. Right. But it's still a big bucket. It would still be product overall. How do you know the impact of a new feature over this NPS? And especially unless it's mentioned in comments, which is not very often, it's really, really hard to link it. Right. So I don't think it's one perfect metric, but what I usually preach for and try to create is the North Star metric for each of the company, right. Really having that metric that is linked to clients' needs, but also to business value. and to your economic model directly, that will really move the needle for the whole company. Like this, everyone is going in the same direction, even teams outside of all the different product teams. And then I think each of the teams can have their own metric that matters, that is linked to that, because maybe some products are more like we need more activation. Some products are more like I need to work on engagement or on retention or a specific problem. But I think that North Star metric is always very helpful to understand the big impact that we're trying, like what we're trying to move, and then see what's your piece. Like, how am I moving a metric that is impacting the North Star metric? And it's quite magical. Like sometimes it's quite hard. Like in some cases, it seems quite obvious to find your North Star metric. In other cases, it's quite a challenge. But once you do it, like the alignment gets way better. And the way teams start measuring, it's also very different. And if you link that to OKRs and to the team's missions, and so it becomes very, very effective.
Right. It's funny because the latest episode that went live today of Excuse My SaaS, we were touching on this topic because we were talking about data as a way to align teams. And Charlotte was mentioning exactly your methods of North Star, the approach of North Star, and user activation rate as a North Star metric for teams, because it's kind of at the crossroad of many. Marketing can produce resources to increase user activation. Sales can help pass the line, and so on. And product as well can make the product easy enough to be able to activate and get to the value as fast and well as possible. So that's a good one. Can we find one day this one North Star metric to rule them all in B2B SaaS?
I mean, it depends. I think some companies will be quite like, okay, I don't know. I think there's some that seems very easy, right? Like Airbnb with the number of nights spent. It seems quite easy. But for example, one of the trickiest ones I had was like I was CPO for this company that was doing predictive maintenance for elevators. So basically we had hardware on the elevators and then we had softwares for 3 different personas. So the tricky part was that without the hardware, and our pricing was linked to the hardware, not to the software that was linked to the users. But you needed to activate the users in order to actually be able to have retention on the hardware. So that was super tricky to actually find a metric that could encompass both like this user activation that we needed, but also the business
hardware piece,
which was linked to the hardware and the quality of the hardware that was very important in the whole process. So we rated a lot on it, and like in the end, I don't remember exact, but I think it was something like number of activated hardware bits. But it was still like quite a complicated calculation, and thought a lot about it because usually you want it to be very straightforward. And in this case, it was a mix of like, if it's too straightforward, we're missing a big chunk of the value. But in the same time, you don't want to make it too complicated. So I think there are some cases where you can be quite straightforward if you've done the North Star metric a lot, but there are cases where you just need to adapt it. And I think it's also something that changes in time, right? I mean, your vision, your strategy always also change as well. So I would never go for a golden rule for things.
That's fair. Fair enough. Now, a lot of people are skeptical about this. How do you measure the potential revenue impacts of a product ID when so many variables are unknown? Is it still just guessing and surviving enough guess and mistakes?
No, we can do better than guessing. I mean, I think it's not an easy one, but first of all, we say a lot like, how do we have impact on the revenue? I think we should think more in terms of financials, and I would say like, how do we have impact on the EBITDA really? Because cost is also an important aspect. I mean, it's like, how do I grow the revenue, but also like, how do I balance with the costs? From whenever I start building the strategy, I will see also the repetition of costs into these different buckets that are going to bring extra revenue this year. And AI features, for example, are quite a good example, right? Because the cost can be quite high.
Right.
And if you do not think of cost and monetization, well, you need to have a meaningful enough problem, right? Because if not, the AI in itself won't be enough. But then the cost of AI and then monetization needs to be thought from day one. So that's why I think the cost part, it's really important, and really thinking in terms of EBITDA. But then for the revenues, there are also a few things. there are also, I think, multiple ways of thinking in terms of revenues. Like it can be revenue growth, which is like cross sell or upsell or acquisitions or
New
other
business.
new business, exactly. But it can also be linked to revenue retention, which is also important, right? I mean, we all know how important retention is on existing clients and client satisfaction. So a lot of times when I prioritize my initiatives in my strategies and in my roadmaps, I will be very, very clear on which of these initiatives impact either revenue protection or revenue growth, or maybe like a mix of them depending on how I go about it in time. Another thing that you need to start thinking from day one is monetization as well. Like, is this feature going to be paid extra? How is this going to be fixed in the pricing plan? Is this an extra module? Is it just something that is, I don't know, in the premium plan? Or is this more something that plays into satisfaction and activation and not exactly into something that I will price extra right away? But
Right.
not like how is that, how am I defining the rest of the growth? And we were talking about sales and marketing before. I think this is also something that is really important to collaborate on with sales and marketing teams. We need to understand, when I was saying we prioritize, earlier I was saying I always prioritize with business impact and client pain. It's also, I think in the business impact, there's also the propensity to buy part. There's also the pricing point, right? We're taking a lot of bets whenever we innovate or we take out new features. I think collaboration with sales and marketing teams are also very important to understand better what would be that pricing model or propensity to buy. Or sometimes, like we sometimes run market surveys in order to really better understand where clients stand today on a certain topic in their usage or how they see the products and the pricing and the rest of the points. So that's why I think if you take all these things into account of like the cost, the revenues, but also the, again, really the data and how you can move it, I think you will do way better than guessing. Even though it's not, I mean, of course, a lot of things change and we need to adapt all the time, but there are these methods that really help getting quite accurate on those hypotheses.
I think controlled bets is definitely possible. Also, what we believe at ProdCamp and what we advocate for, like you sell CS as proxies, and by connecting a few dots, we can already tie action to profit. So that's great. Now, we could not record this episode without talking about this part of your background. You've worked with fast-scaling companies like Aircall, when revenue is growing like crazy, because that was the case for Aircall. How do you keep team focused on long-term impact instead of chasing the next shiny object?
That's a great question. I think already it really started with the strategy. I think in the strategy we already had defined beforehand the different bets or the different initiatives that we had. And the teams were also split accordingly. Some of them were a lot of like, how do I enhance existing value? And there were others that were really very much like, I want to do this super innovative thing that I know is going to come out in 1 year or 2. So it was already from the strategy. The teams weren't really like, oh, like how far am I going with this? They had a good vision of what good looks like for each of their features or their products. And then we had very specific initiatives that were very, very on innovation wise. But then, of course, each team in itself had like a delta on how much you can innovate. I mean, what I care about is the impact. So if your next shiny thing brings more impact with less cost or effort, then go for it. I mean, there's no limit to innovation and to great ideas. It's just that it needs to be linked to that impact. If not, we're not just going to do that because it's shiny.
Love it. Couple of bonus questions I will fire at you real quick because we're getting close to the end of this interview. First, if you were starting over as a product leader today, what's the one thing you do differently from day one?
I think I would really go networking faster. I think having this network of fellow leaders that you can go to and really debate on some things and get help and also share with others, it's really priceless. And I think at the beginning when you start, you're a bit like, wow, I need to learn, asking others for their ideas and help. Is this okay? And it's completely okay. And it helps everyone grow so much. So I think it's something that I nourish a lot today, but I think I could have done it earlier. It would have been very, very helpful.
I'm with you, fully with you here. I'm giving the same one when I'm asked. Another one, what's your most controversial opinion about product management? What do most product leaders get wrong?
I have one about product leaders. That's not super linked to product, but I'm also a professional coach, and I had coaches. I had executive coaches for a few years now, and I feel it's still taboo. Like there are a lot of either, I don't know, CEOs or CPOs who feel that, oh, like if I go talk to a coach, maybe I'm not good enough.
Right.
And yeah, like asking for help, maybe it's not okay. But actually, it's not about being strong or not. I mean, people I coach are amazing product leaders, but just having someone balancing ideas and challenging you with different view, it's so powerful. And I think for me, it's very, might be controversial or not, but it's very wrong to just think like, if I'm a CPO and I go to tell my CEO that I need a coach, I'm gonna say that I'm...
You're gonna think I'm not good enough,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. When actually, I think this should be something that could ideally should even come from with the job. You have someone you can balance your ideas off, that can support you during onboarding or later in really tough times, and it makes everyone so much more effective, and it really toughens your skills even more. So yeah, I think definitely I recommend this one, even if it's a hard conversation sometimes with your boss.
It is, but it starts with leadership. A lot of things are starting with leadership and the culture they kind of pour in their team. So that's a big one, I think.
How much do you encourage growth? Do you encourage debates? How much yeah, exactly.
One last before we go, if you could ban one word or phrase from every product team's vocabulary, what would it be and why?
Oh my God, there's so many, especially all the acronyms that no one understands but us. If I need to pick one, I think I would say failure. Because I think a lot of times teams are just afraid of failure, but in the wrong definition of the term. I mean, they're going to do something really big in terms of product because they're afraid their MVP is too small. They're going to be afraid to test. And even when they test, they're going to be like, but if it failed, but actually the whole idea of a test, because we've been talking a lot today about this hypothesis and testing, is that if your hypothesis is wrong, you're not putting your money on the wrong thing. So that's a win. I mean, it has nothing to do with failure. It has to do with learning. And I think that's the main thing that I would love to fundamentally change in product teams.
Thank you. And that's a wrap for our today's episode. Thank you for the eye-opening conversation, Alexandra, for challenging us to think differently about products. To question the problem we're tackling and what to do to refocus our expensive engineering resources on delivering impact. Thanks also to you all for listening to Excuse My SaaS, hosted by ProdCamp. We hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, don't forget to connect on LinkedIn with us, subscribe, share this episode with people that might find it interesting, and join us for more field stories from SaaS leaders. Until next time, keep discovering, keep building, and keep creating value. See you soon. Thank you again, Alexandra.
Thank you. Bye-bye.